Bon dia a tots i a totes. Soc Rosa Suñol, dirigeixo l'Institut Avedis Donabedian i som l'entitat que ahir vam guardonar, gràcies al suport de Sarco Vitae, el professor McKee com a Premi Donabedian Internacional, que nosaltres en diem el Premi Humanot, amb reminiscència del que deia el Josep Pla. Un humanot era una persona que era especial, però no només per la seva rellevància personal, sinó també per la seva rellevància científica, sinó per la seva rellevància personal. Era un caràcter, és el que haguéssim dit, tot un caràcter. Aquest any l'humanot internacional és el professor McKee, que és professor de Salut Pública a la London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, aquell lloc que tots els especialistes en salut pública peregrinem per saber què s'està creant al món en l'àmbit de la salut pública. El professor McKee té un llarguíssim currículum que jo crec que en aquest moment no val la pena plantejar en detall, però és codirector del Centre Europeu per Salut a les Societats en Transició. És especialista en anàlisis de transicions de salut brusques. A ell devem una interessantíssima col·lecció de llibres que es diu Health Systems in Transition, sistemes de salut en transició, que ens permet entendre com es comporten les societats quan hi ha transicions ràpides, i transicions ràpides poden ser des del desmoronament dels sistemes de salut als països de l'est de la Unió Europea o a Rússia, com els canvis realitzats per la crisi, com l'adopció de nous models, com la integració assistencial de forma ràpida a Europa, és a dir, és especialista en els canvis que es produeixen a la societat de forma brusca. Per això li hem demanat que faci aquesta presentació. El professor McKee té nombrosos guardons, reconeixements internacionals, és reconegut com a, ja ho diré, professor emèrit, professor honorari a 3 universitats europees i és comandant de l'Orde de l'Imperi Britànic anglès per les seves aportacions en els cuidados de salut. Li hem demanat que ens faci una reflexió sobre el tema de l'atenció a llarga estada i l'envelliment a Europa. És a dir, com serà aquesta transició ràpida, aquesta transició que estem dient que està produint perquè la gent està envellint, perquè em sembla que ens estem repetint tots moltes coses que potser no són totes exactament certes i per tant els hem demanat que faci una presentació a little bit provocative.
Some politicians think so.
Sobre el desenvolupament i per tant li agraïm molt la seva presència aquí. So thank you, Martin, and thank you for being here with us.
Moltes gràcies. Estimada amics i companys, forgive me for not speaking in Catalan. In fact, the godfather of our daughter is Catalan. Some of you may know Josep Figueres in World Health Organization. So really I should be able to say a little bit more, but you will forgive me. Could I have a little bit more light here, just on this? Is that possible? Can I get a little bit more light? Just on this. The lights have gone dark and I can't quite see my... Oh, well, I'll be fine.
Una mica és de llum, sisplau.
It's okay. And I'd like to also bring greetings from the Royal College of Physicians in London to the Royal College of Physicians here. I live in a country that is itself not very closely integrated with the rest of Europe, as you know. But within that country there are many organizations that do see themselves as integrated with Europe and having much to learn from the rest of Europe. And one is the Royal College of Physicians, and if you know our journal, Clinical Medicine, you will know that we have regular articles on issues such as quality and the regulation of the medical profession in Europe, in usually every second or third edition. So I'm delighted to be here in this building and with the college here talking about this today. There is a little bit of an irony in coming from England to talk to people in Catalonia about integration and about quality. I am coming from a health system that is fragmenting rapidly, whereas you, over many years, have been leaders in areas like health targets, and we have frequently cited the work in Catalonia in our work in the European Observatory, the innovative work that you have done on quality, led by Rosa, work on health status measurements by people like Jordi Alonso and others, and there are many Catalan academics and others that have contributed. So I hope I can live up to your expectations. You have a great deal of expertise here to draw on without bringing anyone from anywhere else. And I have a challenge, because the area that I'm going to talk about, long-term care, is one that has been the subject of relatively little research, relatively little evaluation. Dr. Ledesma was talking about the innovative work that you are proposing in Barcelona, in Catalonia. And I would urge you to evaluate that rigorously and to publish the results so that we can learn from your experience. As you will see, as I go through this presentation, there are many innovations across Europe, but unfortunately, very few are adequately evaluated and described. So what do we mean by long-term care? The first question here is fundamental. It's a political question, but often we ignore it. We assume that everyone else agrees with what we think, even though they may not. How you answer this question fundamentally shapes your approach to long-term care. Do you believe that this is a universal service that almost all of us will need at some stage? Or do we, as relatively prosperous, typically middle-class people, believe that this is something that the state should only provide for the very poor, and as a safety net for them, not for us? How do we see the delivery of long-term care? Are we all in it together, or is it simply there to pick up if our families and our own resources fail? And because people answer that question differently in different places, we see that the systems that are in place differ enormously. They differ across Europe in the role of professionals. They differ in the eligibility for services. They differ in the system of financing. Do people pay directly? Are they reimbursed? Does someone else pay? Do they get benefits in kind? We have already heard the challenge of complexity in Catalonia because there are so many different groups that may need care. People with learning disabilities, people with physical disabilities, older people, people with multiple disabilities, children, and so on. This is a very complex group of people to care for, and to bring them together and to integrate the services is incredibly challenging. And systems differ in the extent to which they are linked to the health system. Frequently, they are separate, and frequently people fall between the cracks between the two elements, and very much else. So this is our first problem in Europe. We're not comparing the same things in different places. I want to say more about long-term care and its relationship with social care, because they are a little bit different. Social care includes long-term care, but it also includes the short-term care for people after discharge from hospital. And that, in many countries, is becoming critically important, as we will see. It also includes palliative care. And we know from work across Europe that palliative care varies enormously. And this is one area where the United Kingdom actually does quite well. With my colleague Helena Ligido-Quigley, we have done a lot of work interviewing British pensioners who have retired to Spain. And overwhelmingly, they report the Spanish health system as fantastic, at least until recently. And as some of you may have seen our paper on the situation, the more recent situation in Valencia. But their view of the Spanish system is incredibly positive. But the one area where there are problems, or the two areas actually, home care and palliative care, which unfortunately are not so good. Everything else they really love. Long-term care is delivered in different places. Hospitals, care homes, purpose-built dwellings, and ordinary homes. Very heterogeneous. And long-term care is changing. In English, the word patient is derived from the idea that people who were waiting death would be patient. They were patiently awaiting death, usually in religious institutions, cared for typically by nuns. But of course, now people with long-term problems are being kept alive for long periods of time. They often, and Dr. Inesta said this, reminded us that they often want to be cared for in their own homes, what we call aging in place. They want to be close to their families if that is possible, and this is a problem in modern society because often people are more mobile. 3 generations ago, most of your grandparents would probably never have left their town or village, like mine. And if they did, they would go to America or somewhere else and they would never come back. But now people move all over the place. And long-term care is changing because, of course, technology offers new solutions. Now, these changes have raised a fundamental problem, and the fundamental problem is illustrated in this slide. This is telling us that the number of over 65s for every 100 adults is going up, so that by 2035 in Europe it will be 44% of the population. Now, the message is clear, and we've already heard some reference again, Dr. Inesta mentioned this. This suggests that the system is unaffordable. We cannot afford it. I would argue that we cannot afford not to have a system unless we are prepared to leave old people to die in the street, and I don't think we are. And it's very misleading. It assumes that everyone between 18 and 65 pays for everyone age under 18 and over 65. But they do not. In many of our countries, your country and mine, many people in their 50s leave the workforce with early retirement or sickness or whatever. But many people also work much longer. And you will know many people aged over 65 who do not feel themselves to be dependent. There are large numbers of people over 65 from the United Kingdom on the tour buses around Barcelona, going to the museums, helping to support the Miro Foundation and the Picasso Museum. And these people are perfectly healthy. They are contributing to society in many different ways. And so what we find is that in many industrialized countries, there are more people of working age than older people who are actually outside the workforce because the older people are still working, they're contributing. We see that pension ages are increasing almost everywhere. I've mentioned an increasing number of over 65s are in work, and the over 65s are much more healthy than they were several decades ago. The key question that we have to answer relates to the issue of compression of morbidity. Is it the situation that as people live longer, they live longer with poor health? Or is it that as they live longer in good health? That is absolutely key. Are today's 65-year-olds as healthy as people who were 55 in the past? And the answer is that in many ways they are. They are much healthier than people before. This is an incredibly important study that has not had enough attention. It's from Carol Brain's group at Cambridge. And what it demonstrates is that if you look at the age-specific rate of dementia in people in England over the last few decades, it is falling. It is not the case that people who were over 90 would be as likely to have dementia now as they were in 2 decades ago. The OECD has looked at this in more detail, and it has looked, in particular, it's looked at the typical measure that we quote, the over 65 rate, what percentage of the population is over 65. But it's also said that let's recognize that we're really interested in people who are approaching death. And if we say, what is the share of the population with more than 15 years of up to 15 years of life expectancy left, then the solid line, the old age, the classic old age dependency rate is clearly going up. But if we look at the percentage of the population with life expectancy remaining, it's going up, but it's flattening. And if we look to the future, what we see is that as pension ages rise, and as people are healthier in old age, the fundamental, the line at the bottom shows that there is no change right up to 2050 in the percentage of the population with remaining life expectancy of under 15 years. And the real elderly dependency ratio, when you take these factors into account, has gone up, it's coming down, and will actually be relatively stable. So old people are healthier. The challenges that we face certainly exist, but they're not insurmountable. But there are people who are arguing that we cannot afford the systems we have. This is a famous book by a British politician, a former minister in the current government. I think what we're seeing in a number of countries, certainly in my own, and you might want to reflect on what is happening here, is an attempt to argue that the welfare state is unaffordable, to divide us among each other, typically between the native population and migrants, but between young and old, and arguing that the solution is that everyone must pay for themselves and ideally go away and die quietly. That is not the case. We can afford the systems, and we must afford the systems. But there are challenges. And this is the challenge in a paper taken from The Lancet, which looks at the number of people with different frequencies of health disorders with increasing age. These are people with medical conditions that are being treated. They have hypertension that is controlled. They may have diabetes that is controlled. They may have arthritis, but they're taking non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. Of course, they have problems. But it's the complexity of it, so that you can see that by the time you get to about 85, most people have maybe 8 medical problems. Now, those medical problems may not limit them, but they do need to be treated. And they need to be treated by professionals who can cover all of the different conditions. So this is the real challenge. It's the complexity. And the complexity is also seen in the way that we need to bring together different elements to provide long-term care. So long-term care includes domestic assistance with activities of daily living using the telephone or food preparation. It requires help with personal care, with dressing and feeding and washing. Support in terms of providing information and education. Technical skills. In some cases, some people will have prostheses or stomas or catheters, and rehabilitation. So it is very complex. All of these elements need to be brought together. Now, of course, in Catalonia, you're very familiar with complexity, and I'm not sure if Dr. Lederson was talking about the Miro picture, or maybe an integrated circuit is where we would like to be. I'm not sure that Miro ever tried to integrate it in the way that we have on the left. But complexity is the real challenge that we face. And that has taken us to the quest for integration that you've already talked about. The question that we have to ask, however, is what does the evidence say? Is integration a good idea? This is a systematic review that has just been published. of integration of services for adults with chronic diseases. Most of the studies that were included assessed comprehensive services either across the care continuum from hospital or pre-hospital care into the community, or looked at trying to get shared routines among the different professionals that were working. But what these studies did not do was to look at the organizational culture, or the governance structure, or the financial management. And of course, the problem is that if you want to read research from another country, you need to understand whether the organizational culture, the financial mechanisms, are comparable to what you have, because if they are not, you may do the exact same thing, but you may not get the same result. So what did these studies find? Well, they found that there were beneficial effects of integration: reduced hospital admissions and readmissions, improved adherence to treatment guidelines, or quality of life. But crucially, few found evidence that costs were reduced. So if you are doing these things, do not necessarily expect that it will be cheaper. It may be better, but it may not be cheaper. And this is exactly the same as we found in the past with the hospital at home ideas. The care may improve, but they are no cheaper than the alternative. So what do we find when we look across Europe? Well, there are numerous studies that have tried to explain why different countries do things differently. They have described the differences in the share borne by the public and the private sector, the division between local and national initiatives. But what they find is that the models in place are almost always a product of the initial conditions, what in systems theory we call path dependency. You cannot simply take something from one setting and drop it into another. And the research has suggested that all of the systems, wherever they look in Europe, have strengths and weaknesses. But it is very difficult to work out which are the features of the model and which are the features of the broader context in which they have been implemented. Now, there has been some work from the Ancien project to bring all of this together. And in this study, they looked at the systems in place in different European countries and plotted them on two axes. One was organizational depth, where those countries with high scores were well integrated, clear guidelines for people, high level of quality assurance. And the other axis was the amount of money that was spent. And what they found was that there was one cluster, and I'm not sure if I can show this here, at the top right-hand corner, with some of the northern European countries primarily, that were both generous and had good organization. There were some countries at the bottom, mainly in the Eastern European countries, that were not well funded and not particularly well organized, and a large group of countries in the middle, including both of our countries. Culture and beliefs is incredibly important. How we view people with older people with dependencies. Nordic countries typically see the care of older people as the responsibility of the state. People pay high taxes, but they get generous provision in return. In Anglo-Saxon countries, UK, Ireland, or England and Ireland, because Scotland is more continental, people pay low taxes but then take responsibility for themselves, and the state is only there as a safety net. In Mediterranean countries, traditionally the family has been the natural provider, and in Eastern Europe, few people lived into old age until recently, and where they were looked after by mainly female relatives. So this is the inherited culture in all of our countries. There are a number of empirical studies that have looked across Europe, and these have really struggled to draw out any generalizable lessons. I just mentioned a few: the SoCare study, the ProCare study, all showing wide variation in provision, no consistent European vision, fragmentation between health and social care, welfare and housing, Alzheimer Europe, where a lot of people are living in their own homes, but often with very little support. And in the Eurofam Care study, looking at family support, they did find that almost everywhere there was a need for support for informal caregivers, and I'll talk a little bit more about them later. For respite care, this is care when people are living in their own homes, cared for by their families, but then go into accommodation for a few weeks each year to give the family a holiday. Daycare arrangements, specialist in palliative care, volunteer support, and technical adaptation. Now, the problems varied, but everywhere there were problems. We can look at this study again and see that we can see the provision of informal care. And what we're seeing is that almost everywhere, between 40–60% of the over 80s are receiving some sort of informal care from family and neighbours and friends and so on. The over 65s, it's lower. So informal carers are still playing a significant role almost everywhere. Much higher in countries like the Czech Republic, Germany, Belgium, and Spain actually is relatively low in comparison to some of the other countries, which may be a surprise. Who is providing informal care? A question in the Eurobarometer study asked, do you provide informal care now, or have you provided it in the last 10 years? And again, we're seeing between 10 and 20% of the population right across Europe are providing care for someone. 1 in 10, 1 in 5 people. So in this room, I suspect many of you are providing care for elderly relatives or for friends. So this is a really important issue. What about paying for care across Europe? Again, we don't have many lessons. We see that the systems vary enormously in the share borne by the person who is receiving care, in the services included, and the care groups provided. One of the issues which is becoming more topical is the support for people with mental disabilities, with cognitive decline. Because in some countries we find that physical disability gets a much higher priority than mental disability. And there is a reason for this, because in countries like Germany and some of the Baltic states, the systems were set up particularly to support people who were injured in the Second World War, who had lost limbs or had other physical damage. Of course, many of those people also had mental problems, post-traumatic stress disorder and so on, but that was not recognized when the systems were in place. So often we see traditional systems that give a high priority to physical disorders because of the relationship with the Second World War, and give little priority to mental problems. That is changing. And now we are seeing some countries making specific provision for people with dementia, like Belgium is doing. The only conclusion that we can really draw from this evidence is that the simpler systems with fewer co-payments and fees, then the easier it is to obtain access. There are many different models of state support. So, for example, we see personal budgets, we see money being given, a certain amount of money per month. In some cases, there's none. And in some cases, there's an assessment which relates to which determines the amount of money you get. So what you can see is that across Europe, there are very many systems that are in place. The tragedy is that we still know very little about which is better and which is better in which place. Personal health budgets are something that is being talked about in a number of countries. The idea is that you give people, older people or people with multiple disabilities, a certain amount of money, and then they decide what they want. This clearly is more responsive to their needs, but in practice we are seeing that this is also causing many problems, because many of these people are vulnerable, they're easily exploited, and people will queue up to take money away from them. It's a little bit like the British tourists on the coast of Spain who were persuaded to give up a lot of money for timeshare properties in the 1970s and the 1980s. So we see the exploitation of ignorance. Case management can help, but it's very difficult to avoid capture by the providers. In-kind benefits where the services are directly provided provide little choice and may be inappropriate to people's needs, but they do avoid many of the problems of personal health budgets. We looked at the Dutch experience of personal health budgets because our government has been very keen on the idea, I think largely because its long-term vision is to give everyone a voucher, a sum of money for their overall health care for ideological reasons. And we saw that the Dutch system had been rolled back considerably. They had cut back the system a great deal because of the fraud and because of the inappropriate use of funds, using funding for some alternative therapies with no evidence base, and the problem of what happens when the budget runs out. So, good idea in theory, but the practical experience so far is not that encouraging. We see that there is a growing emphasis on support for informal caregivers. In many countries, of course, people receiving, who are providing informal care get no support. But in a few, they're now getting formal training. In Belgium, in England, some informal carers are actually provided with money from the social security system, providing they're not family. There is an expectation the family will do it for free. In some countries, even the family members are also supported if they provide informal care, but they may need to draw up formal contracts with hours of work. And in some countries, like England again, the overall assessment of the patient or the care recipient includes assessment of their care, of their informal caregivers. The ownership varies greatly. Overall, predominantly it is public across Europe, but not everywhere. And the private sector clearly plays a role. This is a challenge because it's proving increasingly difficult for private investors to make the same sort of profits from long-term care as they can from doing other things like running hotels or running supermarkets. Remember that if you invest your money, you can invest it in anything. You don't necessarily invest it in social care, you invest it where you will get the best rate of return. We're seeing a real problem with this in the United Kingdom, where the care provision, long-term care provision, is now largely private. And the companies have been able to work all right so far by driving down wages, having very low skill levels, but this is causing problems in terms of the quality of care. And the government is also recognizing that it is causing a problem because the government is supporting these low-paid workers by welfare benefits to bring them up to a living wage. There's also a problem if those providers go out of business. And this is what happened. Southern Cross, which was a perfectly viable company until its management bought it out with support from private equity. The company then sold all of the buildings that patients were cared for, so the management made a fortune by selling the buildings, and the idea was that the buildings would then be rented back from the other company. Unfortunately, the fees paid by the older people could not pay the rent, and the company, Southern Cross, closed. Moving old people from one home to another kills them. You cannot take vulnerable elderly people and just move them around. And that was what happened, and many of them died. So, we now have the challenge of integration. How do we achieve this? There's the holy grail. Everyone, everywhere, wants to integrate services. We have seen evidence that it can be effective, it can improve the quality of care, although it may not be cheaper. There are essentially three models. One model is where you have a single organization providing everything, different professional groups within that. Another is where one or more organizations coordinates the care provided by different organizations. either coordinating it for individuals with care plans or demarcation of responsibilities across organisations. And the other is a voluntary arrangement where people just come together. Essentially, well, I've said much of this already. One organisation, you get good integration, clear differentiation, good access, although you may not include everything within that. Coordination can be quite challenging, but again, it can work. The voluntary system is just coming together where it is needed. We see different models across Europe. I won't go through them in detail, but there are many examples we can see from France, from Finland, from Italy, from the Netherlands, and both for general care and for dementia, where countries have adopted a single model to care for either all patients or particular client groups. Other countries, especially those with social insurance models, have gone for coordination bodies, new models that organise multidisciplinary consultations among the different professionals, that try to coordinate the primary care, as in Belgium. Case managers in Germany who help patients and long-term care recipients to navigate their way through a complex system. A system for older people in Italy to develop care plans. So all of these systems exist. The problem is that very few of them are rigorously evaluated. So we know that they exist, but we don't know how well they're doing. A particular concern is arising with post-discharge care. And this is something that we're really seeing a problem in the United Kingdom now. If you look at the Guardian newspaper today, on the front page, you will see that the National Health Service is right at the top of public concerns. And the government is very worried because our hospitals are essentially cracking. They cannot get patients out of the beds because the social care budget has been cut by 1/3. And that means they cannot get patients in. So there is a real crisis at present. The crisis is in the hospitals, but it is because of the cutbacks to social care. So there is increasing recognition that there is a need to help older, frail people with multiple complications to be discharged. Models in Finland, the Palko model, which only lasted for a short time, coordinated care pathways, but many, many local initiatives. Do these systems work? Well, this is one of the rare examples of a good evaluation, and I really would encourage you in Catalonia to consider in your new models building in evaluation right from the beginning, maybe even in randomized controlled trials. It can be done. It's not impossible. And this was 22 Finnish municipalities where they looked at generic care or case management for post-discharge patients. And it was a sort of black box in a way, because the actual model varied according to the municipality. It took account of the context. What they found, unfortunately, was that there were no health benefits, but there was some evidence of improved physical mobility. But they also found that the staff believed that the process of care improved. So we need a lot more research to see if this really works. Case management for patients with dementia, and this is a systematic review that is relatively recently out. And what it found 6 randomized controlled trials. It did find that case management was associated with some better outcomes, either clinical outcomes or resource utilizations, but the effects were not terribly large. What was found to be important were the integration between health and social care organizations and the intensity of the management. And I think this is a lesson we see in all models of integration. The systems that work best are the more closely integrated ones, and the ones that actually devote adequate resources. If you're going to do this, it will not be cheap. You will need money to do it. The workforce is a problem for us all. And one of the reasons why all European countries are seeing increasing migration is not just the push factor, not just people fleeing wars in Syria and in North Africa, but also the pull factor, because we need more people to provide care for an elderly population. this is a human resource intensive sector. Wages and status are often low. It is often very difficult to recruit people. So we recruit many migrant workers who may have problems of language and transcultural understanding, and we may not invest in them. We know that the numbers of the staff can make a difference, although, again, context matters. In the systematic review, it found that high staffing levels were sometimes associated with better care and sometimes with worse care. So, for example, some better staffed facilities either used more or less restraint of disturbed elderly people. But in general, having more staff reduces the risk of pressure ulcers, regardless of who is providing it. And we're seeing in particular innovations to support people to come into the workforce to provide long-term care. The Prequal project in a number of countries providing education for migrant women to qualify them for work in the care sector. In Slovenia, voluntary work by elderly people. And of course there are many other examples. These are just a few that have been written up. What about technology? Will technology be the saviour? Well, that's not altogether clear. There's been really little research here, and the research that has been done is often very specific, looking at particular groups and not generalizable. Often there are many exclusions, so the typical patient with multiple problems is not included in the trial. And what it does show is, yes, we can get some better results in adherence to diet and medicines, but the overall effects on the health outcomes is really much more mixed. There's some evidence of the effect of telecare on carers, but it may help a little bit in reducing the stress of carers, but apparently does not provide a major solution to the burden that falls upon them or the quality of life. So telecare may have potential, but it has to be evaluated. We cannot assume that some technological solution will answer all of our problems. There are a number of initiatives to assess quality of care, because we really need to know what is happening. In English, we often talk about long-term care as the Cinderella area. It's the bit that does not go to the ball. It's the bit that is overlooked. And so there are a number of attempts. The RAI scheme is an international scheme to try to develop standards. A number of countries have adopted variants. In France and elsewhere, we have the Care Quality Commission in the United Kingdom. Unfortunately, so far there is little evidence that they are effective. Now, maybe they are effective, but we just don't have the evidence to show that they really work. And one of the problems we have is that things that seem to be a good idea, and we all say, well, they must work, mustn't they, may not actually be that effective. Medication reviews in nursing home residents. Of course, that seems like a good idea, but when you do randomized controlled trials, you actually find that there's no significant difference between doing them and not doing them. Now, maybe that just means that we're not doing them properly. Maybe we need to do them better. But what this does show is that medication reviews, as they are being done currently, are not associated with improvements in care. But we have many problems. And I'm putting in this slide simply because this is a paper that will be published on Friday, and we issued the press release this morning, so you are getting an advance notice of it before the readers in the United Kingdom. But it may feature in the papers on Friday in Britain, a study that we did looking at people who were admitted to hospital from care homes. And we found that those admitted from care homes were 10 times more likely to have high levels of sodium, which is a marker of dehydration, than people admitted from their own home. And even after adjusting for all the measures of case mix, it was still over 5 times higher. And those patients were 60% more likely. So we have a real problem, certainly in the UK, with long-term care. So to close, a few reflections. Long-term care poses challenges for the economy, for the provision of care. But I do not think that these challenges cannot be solved. I think we can solve them all. It's extremely complex, as you all know if you're dealing with it. The models of care vary across Europe, largely reflecting cultural and institutional factors. Everywhere it is fragmented, but there are many attempts to overcome this. Unfortunately, there is remarkably little evaluation to tell us what does and what doesn't work. And even what we think should work may not work. So where do we go from here? What is the agenda for us in the research community and anyone in the practitioner community? We need much more information. We need to describe in much more detail who is receiving long-term care, who is providing that care, and where are they receiving it. We need to do much more work to ask people who are receiving long-term care and those who are providing it what they need and what they want and what they expect. We need to radically change our health systems and our health research agendas to place value on long-term care and recognize its growing importance. We need to show those who provide long-term care that they are valued and they are not to be treated with contempt, with low wages and poor status and poor working conditions. And we need to provide training. And we need to evaluate what is happening. We need to invest in research to understand what does and doesn't work. We need to make connections, to find ways to integrate or coordinate. And we might do one or other. Integration and coordination are different, although they are related. But we need to find ways that work for each place, for each country, for each setting, because it fundamentally is dependent on where you start from. In some places, integration will be easy, in Scandinavia. In some places, like in Germany, it will be incredibly difficult. We need to find appropriate solutions. And we need, finally, to avoid what seem like the easy solutions, like technology. Maybe telecare, maybe modern technology will help, but we cannot assume that it will do. We need to evaluate it to see if it does. Moltes gracias.
Thank you, Professor McKee. Jo crec que el professor McKee ens ha deixat una sèrie de reptes sobre la taula i que aquesta jornada que SAR avui ens convida a tenir ens planteja una sèrie de temes de discussió importants. No? Jo crec que la seva bona notícia és que els reptes es poden resoldre, que tenim reptes importants sobre la taula i que ha sigut, penso jo, interessant al veure que hi ha reptes a tots els àmbits, reptes en l'àmbit del disseny dels sistemes, del suport als cuidadors informals, de la forma d'avançar amb els nous models, la importància de la fragilitat. Per tant, tots vostès que segurament estan enfrontats cada dia amb la reflexió de com millorar l'atenció a aquestes persones, espero que els hagi pogut ser útil aquest plantejament. Tenim temps per un parell de preguntes o qüestions, si algú de vostès vol fer alguna valoració. Per favor. Si es presenta, si és tan amable.
Hola, Emilia. Soc Mireia López, soc infermera d'atenció primària i la setmana que ve defenso la meva tesi de continuïtat assistencial. Té com a títol Infermera més com a element de continuïtat assistencial. Llavors, el ponent ens deia que als països anglosaxons hi ha problemes a l'hora de l'alta hospitalària i que creu que el model hauria de ser en la gestió de casos. Estic totalment d'acord i crec que a Catalunya aquest paper ja funcionava amb l'infermera d'enllaç, però per problemes, suposo, de crisi i de reorganització dels serveis s'ha relativat aquesta figura que crec primordial en els sistemes d'atenció i de continuïtat assistencial entre nivells sanitaris. Només era comentar això, que ja existia a Catalunya i es va dissoldre. Moltes gràcies.
Gràcies pel seu comentari, penso que és un tema, una aportació interessant. Alguna altra pregunta? Si no hi és, a mi m'agradaria fer-li una pregunta, perquè el tema de les transicions entre els sistemes de salut, del que ell és un gran expert, no? Suposo que ha fet que ell hagi sigut capaç d'identificar un patró d'adopció de nous models i com es desenvolupen aquestes adopcions. Algunes recomanacions per lograr en l'entorn d'aquest clúster de països, Anglaterra, Espanya, que tenim aquest abordatge similar de l'atenció de llarga estada, per poder fer aquesta transició d'una manera més fàcil i més efectiva?
Sure. Now, I think the point about learning from similar contexts is very important. And to be honest, I think that there is probably very little that Spain, Catalonia can learn from, say, Germany, because the system is so different in terms of the organisation of healthcare and social care. But I do think that there is much that can be learnt from Italy and perhaps in Portugal, but maybe Portugal can learn more from Spain. Because there are similar systems. And if we look back to the early 1980s, there was a tremendous amount of joint learning. The De Lorenzo reforms, the Abril report, the different models in Spain and Italy and to some extent in Portugal, linked to some extent to the United Kingdom. So the shared learning was taking place then, and perhaps we should be looking more at those comparisons because the family structures are somewhat similar. We can get into the other issue as to whether either Spain or Italy are really unified countries, and I should hesitate to do that in Catalonia because there are differences within each country, big differences within both Spain and Italy at the regional level. But I think that looking at those clusters of southern European countries, and also I think for Spain, Catalonia, to look at Scotland. I think Scotland and to some extent Northern Ireland have a lot to recommend them at the minute. England is going through a very difficult time at the minute. The reforms of our health service were a disaster. I think everybody agrees. And people just argue about why they were a disaster. Was it incompetence or was it something else? But in Scotland, they are holding the system together quite well. And so I would encourage you to look there as well as at Italy.
Dolores.
Le quería preguntar dos opiniones alrededor de dos cosas. ¿Qué cree que es mejor? ¿Un sistema integrado solo para atender al long-term care o para toda la población? Do you think about?
I didn't hear that. I could hear it, but not the translation.
What do you think about the possibility to create a concrete model only for the long-term care or for all the people? What is your opinion? This is the first. I think that is better only one model for all the people, specifically related to age.
Do you mean people with younger people, older people?
All the people.
Oh.
Population wide.
Or a system that integrates health and social care all.
We all want to integrate. We all want to integrate health and social care, but it is incredibly difficult. And I think that in each country, each setting, you need to decide what is possible and what is not. We see that in countries with more social insurance models like France and Germany, coordination plays a greater role, whereas in countries that are tax-based and have more public provision, integration it seems to be the goal, but nobody has achieved it yet. And the problem lies with where you draw the boundary, because you've always got to draw a boundary somewhere. And if you look at long-term care, it is not just for older people. It's for children with learning disabilities, adults with learning disabilities. So then you have an additional interface with the education system. You cannot integrate everything. There will always be something inside and something outside. And the question is, where do you actually draw that, the boundaries? And I think that the more successful models of integration, as I say, are the ones where you have stronger coordination, stronger links, where you spend money, don't try to do it cheaply, but where you accept that there will be some bits that cannot be integrated, some specialist services that will always have to be outside somewhere and brought in as needed, because you have to draw the boundary somewhere, otherwise it will go on forever. I mean, another example we face in the United Kingdom is the growing, and maybe you had it to some extent in Spain, but less, the number of younger people who came back with major disabilities after the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, they need often long-term care. They're a very small group, and there you have an interface with the Defence Ministry as well. So that's another interface for some groups. So there will always be groups that have particular issues, and you can't quite fit them in. I'm in favour of integration, but it has to be related to what is possible in the setting.
But it's possible to make up a project integrated plan with two different systems to access of services, of social and health services, or you need to have only one access services conditions or model?
I think that is a question for each country, for each setting. What works and what doesn't work. If we were in Helsinki, in Finland today, it almost would not be a question, because they have integrated at a municipal level healthcare, social care and unemployment benefit, so that the municipalities pay for the unemployment benefit, and that means that someone who is out of work because they need healthcare is prioritised to get healthcare to get them back into work. But of course they have other problems. And their problem is that they have got a municipality that is 1.5 million people, like in Helsinki, and they have municipalities that are 1,000 people in the far north or less. So they have different problems, but they have managed a high level of integration. It really depends where you're starting, and particularly in Finland and maybe in Sweden to some extent, where you have a very strong level of provision by local government, and where the healthcare, the social care, and often the unemployment, the welfare benefit is integrated within local government. It's easier. For the rest, for other countries, it's more difficult. So it really depends where you're starting from.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Crec que és temps de plegar. Em quedo, però, amb el missatge que jo penso que el professor McKee ha posat clarament en els seus estudis, de que hi ha molts estudis i poques conclusions, i ens deixa aquí a Catalunya el repte de tots aquests projectes que estem iniciant, que segurament són punters a molts àmbits europeus, d'avaluar-los i de poder demostrar que realment ho estem fent bé tots, en l'àmbit de la planificació, a l'àmbit de la provisió del servei i a l'àmbit de l'atenció diària a les persones. Crec que aquest és un repte que no podem oblidar, perquè si realment l'agafem, en els propers 5 o 6 anys estarem en capacitat de demostrar que el que estem fent té un impacte important per a les persones. Gràcies a tots. Anem ara a prendre el cafè i reprendrem en punt de programa la reunió que tenim. Thank you, Professor McKee.
Thank you very much. Right, I will get a